Hey everyone, and welcome back to another deep dive. You ready to get into something kind of heavy today?
Always.
All right, cool. So we're going to be talking about atheism.
Okay.
And I think a lot of times people think about atheism as like a one-sided sort of argument, just like against religion. But today we're going to be looking at the philosophy, like the arguments for atheism.
Yeah, that's right. It's not just a rejection, it's a whole worldview.
Yeah, and we're going to be looking at this book called Atheism, A Philosophical Justification by Michael Martin.
Great book. Lots to unpack there.
Yeah. So to get started, like one of the first thing that I think is important to know is that there are actually different types of atheism.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, most people, when they hear atheism, they just think, doesn't believe in God, right?
Right.
But it's more nuanced than that. There's actually negative atheism and positive atheism.
Okay. I'm intrigued. So what's the difference?
Well, negative atheism is basically just the absence of belief.
Hmm.
Someone who says, I don't believe in God, but they don't necessarily believe that God doesn't exist.
So it's more like they're just not convinced.
Exactly. Whereas positive atheism actually goes a step further and says, I believe that there is no God.
So they're making a claim.
A positive claim, yeah.
Okay. So for our deep dive, we're going to be focusing on the arguments for that positive atheism.
Right. We're going to look at why some thinkers don't just doubt God's existence, but actually believe that he doesn't exist.
Okay, cool. And Martin actually goes into a lot of different arguments, and we're going to kind of go through those.
Yeah, he covers a lot of ground. And one of the first things he addresses is whether the concept of God even makes sense to begin with.
Huh. Okay, so how do you even begin to like question whether God is even a concept?
Well, he brings up something called the verifiability theory of meaning. And this theory basically says that for a statement to be meaningful, it has to be verifiable or at least disprovable in principle.
Okay, so like I could say, there's a cat in that room,
Right.
and we could go look in the room and see if there's a cat.
Exactly. We can test it. But with the concept of God, it gets trickier. How do you test for the existence of a being that's supposed to be outside of our space and time and all that?
Yeah, it's not like you can just pull out a God detector.
Right. And some atheists argue that because of this, a lot of religious language, especially, talk about God kind of fails this verifiability test.
So if you can't even test the concept, is it really even a meaningful concept at all?
It's a really interesting question. And it leads to a lot of debate about the nature of language and belief and all that.
I mean, it really makes you think about like, what are the words we're using and what are we actually talking about?
Exactly. And Martin even brings up this philosopher named Kai Nielsen, who was a big proponent of this idea.
Okay, cool. So, I mean, that kind of sets the stage in a way by questioning like the very foundation of the concept of God.
Yeah, he gets you thinking right off the bat.
For sure. And then he goes into another interesting point about this whole idea of divine commands.
Oh yeah, the divine command theory. That's a big one.
So how does that play into this?
Well, the divine command theory basically says that morality is based on what God commands. Right and wrong are determined by God's will.
Okay.
But Martin points out this kind of tricky dilemma. If God is truly transcendent meaning outside of space and time, how can we even understand the concept of God commanding anything?
Yeah, that's a good point because a command implies a sequence of events, right?
Yeah.
Like first God commands, then we obey. But if God is outside of time, that whole sequence kind of falls apart.
It does, and it raises questions about how we can even conceive of a timeless being interacting with a temporal world.
So that's like one side of the dilemma, right? And what's the other side?
Well, if we try to solve that problem by saying, okay, maybe God is within space and time, so commands make sense,
Yeah.
then God becomes subject to the same kind of scrutiny as any other being in the universe.
Right. We could potentially like track God's movements, observe God's actions the same way we could with, say, a very advanced alien civilization.
Exactly, which opens up a whole new can of worms for traditional religious beliefs.
Yeah, because then it's not just about faith anymore. It's about like scientific evidence and observation.
Right. So which horn of this dilemma is more problematic for the idea of God? It's a question that really gets to the heart of how we define and understand this whole concept.
Okay, so we've got the verifiability theory of meaning questioning whether God even makes sense. And we've got the divine command theory creating this dilemma about God's relationship to time and space.
Yeah, we're just getting started, though.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Martin's got a whole arsenal of arguments waiting for us. And things are about to get even more interesting when we delve into how the concept of evil itself might actually be one of the most powerful arguments against God's existence.
All right, bring it on. I'm ready for round two. All
Let's
right,
go.
so last time we were talking about some pretty heady stuff, like Does the concept of God even make sense? Can we really understand this idea of a God outside of space and time giving us commands?
Yeah, we were diving deep into some philosophical critiques of theism.
Exactly. And now I want to get into one of the biggest worries people have about atheism. If there's no God calling the shots, does that mean morality is just like up for grabs? Does
Oh,
anything go?
it's a common concern. I mean, if there's no ultimate authority dictating right and wrong, how do we know what's good or bad?
Yeah, like does it all just become like totally subjective?
Well, Martin actually addresses this head on in the book. He brings up some really interesting ideas from philosophers like William Frankena, who argued for a more rational approach to ethics, one that doesn't rely on divine commands.
Okay, so instead of getting our morals from like a higher power, we figure them out using reason and logic.
Yeah, it's more about finding a shared understanding of what's right and wrong based on our shared human experience.
So like even without a God, we'd still be able to agree on things like murder is bad and helping others is good.
That's the idea. Franken actually proposed this thought experiment, where you imagine a scenario where everyone has complete information, perfect clarity of thought, and total impartiality.
So like no biases, no emotional clouding, just pure reason.
Exactly. And he argues that in that kind of ideal situation, our moral judgments would likely converge regardless of our individual beliefs about God.
Hmm. So we wouldn't need some kind of divine rule book to tell us what's right and wrong.
Right.
We could figure it out ourselves.
Right. And Martin actually backs this up with some examples from the book. He points out that even without God, the very idea of universalizing moral principles kind of pushes us towards a more objective understanding of ethics.
Okay, what do you mean by universalizing moral principles?
Well, it's like asking yourself, would I want everyone to act this way? If the answer is no, then that action is probably not morally justifiable.
Oh, I see. So like if I'm considering stealing something, I should ask myself, would I want everyone to steal?
Exactly. And if you wouldn't want that to be the norm, then it's probably not a good moral principle.
Hmm. That makes sense. It's not about following rules blindly. It's about reasoning our way to a shared ethical framework.
Right. It's about recognizing our interconnectedness and the impact our actions have on others.
Okay, so we've addressed this worry about morality. But what about the whole existential question of meaning and purpose? You know, that feeling that life is just meaningless without some kind of divine plan.
Ah, yeah, that classic existential angst. That's a big one. And Martin actually tackles it head on. He brings in some fascinating ideas from philosophers like Thomas Nagel.
Oh yeah, Nagel, he's a heavy hitter in the philosophy world.
Yeah, and Nagel's view actually kind of throws a wrench in the whole God is the source of meaning thing.
Okay, how so?
Well, he argues that even with God, we can still step back and look at our lives and even God's supposed purpose for us and ask, why this plan? Why not something else? There's always another layer of questioning.
Hmm. So even if God has some grand cosmic design, it could still feel kind of arbitrary to us.
Right, like why choose this particular universe with these particular laws and these particular beings? There's no guarantee that God's plan is the best possible plan or even a particularly meaningful one from our limited perspective.
So even with a divine creator, the ultimate why of existence can still feel kind of random.
Yeah, it's like even if there's a director behind the scenes of the cosmic play, we're still left wondering why this particular play, why these particular roles, why not something completely different?
I'm starting to see what you mean. So both with and without God, there's this potential for feeling like it's all just a big cosmic accident.
It's a tough question, and Martin doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but it raises a really interesting point for you, our listener. Does this inherent absurdity of existence make atheism more appealing because it acknowledges the problem head on? Or does it just highlight a deeper issue with our very search for meaning in the first place?
Whoa, okay, my brain is definitely doing some mental gymnastics right now.
That's good. That means the gears are turning.
Okay, so we've talked about morality, we've talked about meaning. Now let's get to one of my favorite parts of the book, this argument about the ontological argument, but with a twist.
Oh, yeah. The ontological argument for evil. This one's a real mind bender.
I'm so ready for this. So remind me what the ontological argument is again.
All right, so the classic ontological argument basically tries to prove God's existence through logic alone. It starts with the idea of God as a perfect being.
Right, like the most perfect being imaginable.
Exactly. And then it goes on to say that because existence is a perfection, a perfect being must exist. Because if it didn't exist, it wouldn't be perfect.
Okay, I vaguely remember this from my Philosophy 101 class. But what's Martin's twist on this?
Well, he basically throws the argument back at the theists and says, okay, if that logic works for God, couldn't it also work for a perfectly evil being?
Wait, hold up. Are you saying like the devil?
Not necessarily the devil, but more like a hypothetical being that embodies ultimate evil, just as God is supposed to embody ultimate good.
So like some kind of ultimate supervillain, the embodiment of pure malevolence.
Exactly. And Martin even uses this term, absolute evil one, to drive the point home.
Okay, so if we follow the logic of the ontological argument, it seems like we could just as easily prove the existence of this absolute evil one as we could prove the existence of God.
That's Martin's point. If the argument is sound, then it proves too much. It leads to a contradiction.
So does that mean the ontological argument is just flawed from the start?
It's a possibility. Or it could suggest that this whole concept of a perfect being, whether good or evil, is inherently contradictory.
So maybe we need to rethink our whole approach to defining and understanding these ultimate concepts.
Maybe we do. Now, are you ready to tackle another big one?
Hit me with it.
All right, let's talk about the problem of pointless evil.
Oh, yeah, that's a tough one. So when we talk about pointless evil, we're talking about suffering that doesn't seem to serve any greater purpose, right?
Exactly, like natural disasters that wipe out entire communities or children born with debilitating diseases.
Yeah, it's hard to reconcile that kind of suffering with the idea of an all-good, all-powerful God.
And Martin really digs into this problem. He looks at all the classic attempts to explain it away, like theodicies.
Theodicies, those are those justifications for why a good God would allow bad things to happen, right?
Right, like the idea that suffering is a test of faith, or that it builds character, or that it's part of some grand cosmic plan that we can't fully understand.
Yeah, but those explanations don't always feel very satisfying, especially when you're the one experiencing the suffering.
And Martin points out that most theodicies fail to account for all the suffering in the world. There's always some leftover pain, some unexplained tragedy that doesn't fit neatly into the justification.
And just saying God works in mysterious ways doesn't really cut it either.
Right, it just pushes the problem back a step without actually addressing it.
So this section of the book really leaves you with a question. Can any theodicy truly satisfy our sense of justice and empathy when we're faced with suffering that seems completely pointless?
It's a tough question, and one that each of us has to grapple with in our own way.
Man, this deep dive is really making me confront some uncomfortable truths.
That's the power of philosophy. It challenges us to think critically about our beliefs and assumptions.
For sure. Okay, so we've looked at this problem of pointless evil. Now, what about the classic free will defense? You know, the argument that God allows evil because it's the price of giving humans free will.
Ah, yes, the free will defense. That's a popular one, but Martin doesn't let it off the hook that easily.
I figured he wouldn't. So how does he critique it?
Well, he starts by asking some tough questions. Does free will really justify all the evil in the world? Couldn't God have created beings with free will who were less prone to evil, less likely to inflict suffering on each other?
So it's not just about having free will, it's about the kind of free will we have and the choices we make with it.
Exactly. And he brings up this really interesting concept called transworld depravity.
Transworld depravity. That sounds intense. What is that?
It's the idea that humans are inherently flawed, not just in this world, but across all possible worlds.
So it's like no matter what universe God created, we'd still be messed up.
It's a provocative idea, and one that really challenges the free will defense, because if humans are inherently flawed, then it's not really a matter of God giving us free will and then we just happen to choose evil. It's more like God created us with a predisposition towards evil and then gave us the freedom to act on it.
So it's like God set us up for failure from the very beginning.
It's a tough pill to swallow, for sure. And Martin actually pushes the argument even further by asking, why couldn't God have created a world where humans freely choose good more often? Is a world where we naturally gravitate towards goodness truly incompatible with free will?
That's a really interesting question. That makes you wonder if maybe we're thinking about free will in too limited a way.
Maybe we are. Now, so far, we've focused on Martin's critiques of theistic arguments. But he also offers some really interesting ideas about how to live a meaningful and ethical life, even without belief in God.
Okay, I'm definitely curious to hear about that. Yeah. Because up until now, it's felt a bit like we've been deconstructing without reconstructing.
I hear you. And that's exactly what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive. We'll delve into Martin's positive vision for atheism and how it can provide a framework for a fulfilling life, even without relying on religious beliefs.
All right, I'm ready to get into that.
Yeah.
This conversation has been pretty heavy, but also super thought-provoking.
That's what we aim for here at the Deep Dive.
All right, so we've been going pretty deep into the philosophy of atheism, exploring all these arguments against God's existence. But now I want to kind of bring it back down to earth a bit. You know, like, what does all this actually mean for how we live our lives?
It's a good question. I mean, at the end of the day, philosophy isn't just about abstract ideas. It's about how we understand ourselves and our place in the world.
Exactly. So if we accept these arguments for atheism, does that mean we're just doomed to live in a cold, meaningless universe with no hope, no purpose, no nothing?
Well, Martin certainly doesn't think so. He actually spends a good chunk of the book addressing this very concern. He explores the real-world implications of atheism for things like morality, happiness, even our fear of death.
Okay, so let's start with morality. We talked earlier about how atheism doesn't necessarily lead to moral relativism.
Mhm.
But if there's no God to judge us, no heaven or hell, to worry about what's to stop us from just being selfish jerks.
Yeah, that's a common worry. But Martin argues that morality doesn't have to be based on fear of punishment or hope of reward.
So then where does it come from?
Well, he points to the inherent value of human life itself. The idea that we all have this shared experience of being alive, of feeling joy and pain, of wanting to flourish.
So it's about recognizing that we're all in this together, that our actions have real consequences for others, regardless of whether there's some cosmic scorekeeper watching.
Exactly. It's about cultivating compassion and empathy, not because we're commanded to, but because we understand that causing suffering is inherently wrong. We experience it ourselves, we witness it in others, and that shared experience should ideally guide our actions.
Okay,
Hmm?
I can see that. So it's a morality grounded in our shared humanity, not in fear of punishment or desire for reward. It's pretty
Yeah.
cool. What about the whole fear of death thing? That's something that I think a lot of people struggle with when it comes to atheism. If there's no afterlife, no soul that lives on, how do we cope with that finality?
It's a natural fear for sure. I mean, death is the ultimate unknown, and it's something that a lot of religions have tried to explain or soften with promises of heaven or reincarnation or whatever.
Yeah, but if we take those promises off the table, it can feel pretty bleak.
It can. But Martin actually offers a different perspective. He says, yes, death is a natural part of life, it's inevitable. But don't let that inevitability rob you of the joy and meaning you can find right now.
So it's about focusing on living a full and meaningful life in the present moment, rather than clinging to the hope of something beyond.
Exactly. It's about finding joy in your relationships, pursuing your passions, contributing to something larger than yourself. Your impact on the world, the memories you create, the love you share, those are the things that endure even after you're gone.
It's a beautiful way to reframe our relationship with death. It's not an ending, it's a culmination of a life well lived.
Okay.
Last bit with happiness. So many people find comfort and hope in their faith, in the promise of heaven or some other blissful afterlife. Can we really be truly happy without that belief?
It's an interesting question, and I think it depends on what we mean by happiness. If we're talking about a kind of superficial, fleeting pleasure, then sure, maybe you can get that from believing in something that makes you feel good.
Yeah, but that kind of happiness is pretty fragile. It can easily be shattered by doubt or disappointment.
Exactly. Whereas Martin is talking about a deeper, more enduring kind of happiness that comes from cultivating inner peace, finding meaning in your life, connecting with others in authentic ways.
So it's about finding happiness within ourselves, not relying on external promises or rewards.
Precisely. It's about appreciating the simple things, practicing gratitude, aligning your actions with your values. This kind of happiness is more resilient, more within your control, because it's not dependent on something outside of yourself.
Wow, this deep dive has been a whirlwind of ideas. We've explored the philosophical arguments for atheism, tackled some of the toughest questions about morality and meaning, and even touched on the emotional and existential aspects of living without belief in God.
It's been quite a journey. And I think what's most striking about Martin's work is that he's not just tearing down, he's also building up. He offers a positive vision for how to live a meaningful and ethical life, even without relying on religious beliefs.
Yeah, it's not just about saying God doesn't exist. It's about saying, okay, if that's the case, then what? Now, how do we make sense of the world and our place in it?
Exactly. It's a call to embrace reason, to cultivate compassion, to find purpose in our shared human experience, and ultimately to create a world where everyone can flourish, whether they believe in God or not.
It's been incredibly thought-provoking, and I'm sure you, our listener, have a lot to mull over after this deep dive.
Absolutely. And remember, this is just one exploration of a vast and complex topic. There are countless other perspectives, arguments, and ideas out there waiting to be discovered. So keep questioning, keep searching, and keep the conversation going.
That's what the deep dive is all about, giving you the tools to think critically and engage with these big questions. We'll be back next time with a brand new topic and a fresh stack of sources to unpack. Until then, keep diving.
Keep diving.
And that's a wrap for today. Catch you in the next deep dive.